Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Free Speech Forward podcast. This is an episode that I'm really looking forward to. Longtime listeners of the show probably know that among the 5 questions we ask, we often ask our guests to share ideas, techniques, recommendations for improving our communication skills. This is definitely something I personally strongly believe that if we're going to build a robust culture of free speech, that the ability to communicate effectively is both a virtue and a skill. And today I'm so excited because we have Erec Smith. I'm still going to call you Professor Erec Smith, who is an expert on the topic of rhetoric. And I'm sure he's going to have some wonderful ideas and suggestions for us on how we all can improve our communication abilities. But I will turn it over now to my co-host and co-founder, Chris, to give you some more insight on Erec and his background.
Great. Thanks, Joia, and thanks, Eric, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you. For our audience out there, as Joia alluded to, Erec Smith is a former professor of rhetoric at York College of Pennsylvania. Although he has eclectic scholarly interests, Smith's work primarily focuses on the rhetorics of anti-racist activism, theory, and pedagogy. He is a co-founder of Free Black Thought, a website dedicated to highlighting viewpoint diversity within the Black diaspora. Smith has discussed the phenomena of race and social justice on television, in short films and op-eds, as well as in books, including A Critique of Anti-Racism in Rhetoric and Composition, The Semblance of Empowerment, published in 2020. Smith is a research fellow in politics and society for the Cato Institute. So with that, why don't we just dive right in? Erec, tell us about your origin story of how you came to being an advocate and a leader for free speech.
Well, I feel like I was always an advocate tacitly for free speech. You know, I like to say what I want to say. I was always writing short stories and things like that since I was a little kid, and I couldn't spell, which drove my big sister insane because I kept asking her how to spell the words so I've been into free expression for quite some time. I became an advocate, though, when I realized that my colleagues in the field of rhetoric and composition were not advocates of free speech. Now, that may blow your mind, and it should, because professors of rhetoric, who don't believe in free speech, that's like
an
a lifeguard
oxymoron.
who doesn't believe in swimming. What was that?
It sounds like an oxymoron almost.
Yes, well, it is an oxymoron. There's no almost about it. So you're
I was
right
being
about
generous, but yeah, you're right.
Yes. So, after that, after I realized that people in my field who basically need free speech to, have their reason to exist, didn't like it, I decided that this was a really big issue and I wanted to dive into it. And so I focused more narrowly on that.
I could definitely see how that comes up. So now I'm curious, when you are conversing with your colleagues or perhaps even the students coming up in the fields of rhetoric, how do you explain to them the importance of free speech and why free speech is so important? Obviously, for someone who is going to be an advocate of rhetoric, but for all of us to live flourishing lives and build a flourishing society.
Well, the Congressman John Lewis once said that without freedom of speech, the civil rights movement would have been a bird without wings, right? Which is to say that it's there for the little guy. It's there so that the underdog, if you will, can say what he or she wants to say and not be punished about it, right? That said, people still tried to suppress that speech, but they failed because we have the First Amendment. So that's important for one thing. But secondly, it's about innovation and new ideas as well. In science, there's replication, right? You do an experiment, you get a certain result, you have other scientists far away do the same experiment to make sure that you're onto something and you're accurate. The humanistic counterpart of that is sharing your ideas in the marketplace of ideas, right? You open your ideas up to scrutiny, and if enough people can say, "Oh, okay, that makes sense," and I can see why it makes sense, then you're onto something. And if not, you have to even try harder if you still think you're right about something, or you have to revise, to fit your ideas to society or a goal you're trying to achieve. So, it's a very important thing. I like it, and I don't understand why people, even if they don't like what other people are saying, why would you want to get rid of free speech? Because I can say something back to them, right? You know,
Yeah.
I can. It'll be my turn eventually, and I can talk.
Hmm.
So I don't get it. You know.
That's fascinating, and I'm curious actually to go back to your earlier point though about some of your colleagues in the field of rhetoric. So, what, how do they square that uh, unsquareable circle, if you will, of being kind of anti? Like, do they come out and explicitly say that they don't believe in free speech, or that are, I guess, they're advocating for certain restrictions on free speech, or is it more subtle than that you detected over time in kind of inconsistencies, or and then what is the argument then if they are explicit about it?
Words are harm. That's the argument.
Mm,
Words are harm. When in reality, we use words to keep from harm because you know what hurts more than words? Bullets.
mm,
You know,
mm-hmm,
that's the whole point of this stuff. That you use those words to make sure things don't get worse, right? If
mm-hmm,
the words are bad, then what are you going to do, right? This is a tried and true tactic for people who are sick of the society in which they live and want to tear it down. If you get rid of free speech and the ability of its citizens to express themselves, that's you're on to a good start,
mm-hmm.
right? So the idea is that, and I heard this in a presentation I went to at a conference. People want free speech so that they can insult us. That's that. I'm not kidding. That's the refrain. The only reason you want free speech is that so that you can say the N word or something like that,
Mm,
right? Which is wildly short sighted and immature.
mm-hmm,
But
mm-hmm.
that's my field right now.
Well, and to your point, even, I mean, one person's insult is another person's just criticism, right? I mean, I'm not the example you just used, of course, but in general, that is how often minority voices and or just out of favor voices are able to raise awareness to their issues or their injustices, right? Is by critiquing, sometimes lampooning, satirizing, and otherwise, majority views and opinions. So that's it's just fascinating to think. I mean, I presume you then make the counter argument to your colleagues in rhetoric, but that's, I guess, not fully surprising to hear, but also still disheartening. You'd think at least some of the disciplines that are most charged with the art of debate would still be dedicated to this value.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with that.
So maybe shifting gears then, given your background in rhetoric, we love this question of our guests is how you prepare to communicate your ideas effectively, either privately or often in a public forum, since you are a professor and an advocate and a writer and out there in the public domain. Can you maybe share with us some of your own tips or processes for preparing to lay out your ideas coherently and compellingly and then communicate them effectively?
Okay, well, the first is more subjective than anything, and the second is more objective than anything. The first is that I I want to make sure I have the proper amount of enthusiasm,
Mm,
for doing this, the proper motivation, and because that helps me prepare better. It's fun preparing, it's satisfactory to a large degree. I want to make sure I have the energy, mentally and physically, right, to write this speech and then deliver it.
mm,
But more generally, I I pertain to this concept of rhetoric called kairos, which is the confluence of time, place, audience, subject matter, and things like that. I have to consider the kairos of a situation before I create a speech or write an op-ed or something like that. So if the kairos, which is often translated as window of opportunity,
mm,
right? If that's not there, then maybe I don't write something or speak about it
mm.
at that moment, or I do differently, right?
Okay.
So you got to gauge the context, and act accordingly. That means audience consideration. What are the values, attitudes, and beliefs of the people who are going to be interested in this subject, right?
Mm-hmm.
Your ethos, your credibility about the subject. It's one thing for me to talk about rhetoric. It's another thing for me to talk about Batman, You know, it's I'm not a professional at Batman, though I
Right.
like to think I am. I'm not.
Yeah.
You know,
So
so
still
there's
entitled to
that.
your opinions, I'm sure,
Yes,
like
yes,
all of
yes,
us.
yes. So, so there's a level of ethos and Kyric preparation. I'll say Kyric preparation. Those are the things.
I love that we already learned a brand new term, Kyric preparation. And this is fascinating because we've had several of these conversations now, and multiple guests of ours have brought up the idea of motivating the audience. You're the first person who's talked about the importance of finding that motivation within yourself, of referring to it as finding your enthusiasm. And
Mm.
I think this is a great insight of combining both that internal drive with, as you refer to it, the window of opportunity, the context, the kairos of the situation in front of you. So I think that's a framework I will definitely take forward into thinking about some of my own preparation for speech and writing. So let's shift gears slightly, and I want to ask you one of my favorite questions that we ask our guests, which is the big blue sky question. The if you had no resource constraints, time constraints, you could have, do anything you wanted to do, what do you think would be the most important project that we could be working on now as a society that would really push forward the momentum for building a more vibrant culture of free speech?
We need to re-emphasize individuality and especially resilience, right?
Mm.
A lack of resilience makes you want to get rid of free speech because people are insulting you. That's a
Mm.
lack of resilience,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, also a concept called defensive confidence, which is the confidence that you have the rhetorical tools to enter into a debate and win,
Mm.
right? A lot of people, even people in the field of rhetoric and composition, lack defensive confidence. And when you lack defensive confidence, you do things like purposely use logical fallacies, you lie, you do all kinds of things. I have examples of this that I'm writing about right now.
Mm.
But resilience and defensive confidence. What's more about defensive confidence? Studies show that people who have the most defensive confidence are more likely to have their minds changed.
Mm.
Why? Because they're willing to enter into the conversation in the first place, not running away from it,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's that as well. So I would focus on resilience, emotional intelligence, I should say,
Mm.
emotional self-awareness, self-management, and things like that. One can also say interpersonal empowerment, not interpersonal, that's important too, but intrapersonal empowerment. How do we empower ourselves? How do we talk to ourselves, right?
Mm.
Those are all the things that I would try to promote if I could, if nothing could stop me.
Can you say more about defensive confidence? You're the first person who's used this term, and I'd love to explore it more. Can you tell us more about, I mean, you've described what it is, but how does one actually start to build that skill? If someone really had, came from the consideration that they had no defensive confidence, how would you start from zero and become someone who is confident in your ability to engage in rhetoric and debate?
Become a student of rhetoric.
Mm.
Learn the important tropes and schemes. Learn the important terms. The rhetorical appeals of logos, ethos, and pathos, which is to say logic, credibility, and emotion. When
Mm.
to use them, how to use them, when to use them together, when to use them separately. Um, talk about the topics of invention, how we come up with ways of talking about things.
Mm.
There's a lot in rhetorical theory that enthuses me, and I think it would enthuse a lot more people if they looked into it. I happen to have right here Aristotle's On Rhetoric,
Oh, great
right,
plug.
which is like
Mm-hmm.
the first large work on rhetorical theory, and I mean I feel like you can just read that and be pretty good, right? A lot of people in my field say that they're trying to move away from this book because of two things. Um, One, it doesn't deal with cultural rhetoric. I think it does.
Mm-hmm.
So I disagree with that. And secondly, a dead white man wrote it, so
Mm.
we have to move away from that, right?
Mm.
Both
Mm-hmm.
those ideas are wrong in my opinion. So yes,
Although,
learning
were the
rhetorical
Greeks
theory.
really white too? I mean, have you been to Greece? It's pretty much in the Middle East.
Yeah,
A
and
lot of
there's
people there
that.
are not really white. Maybe
Then
we
there's
see
that.
their white
Yeah.
marble bust, but when people say that, it always just boggles my mind.
Yeah. I totally get that. I should also say that I think people, when they are thinking about the efficacy of free speech are thinking too broadly. They need to think more locally.
Mm.
And they need to think about where they have a locus of control, right? So town hall meetings, right? Your city council meetings
Hmm.
once a week or something like that. That's where you can speak up and use your rhetoric because you have more influence there than you do trying to get the president to do something, right?
Right.
So start locally and grow from there.
I love that. And I especially love that you plugged Aristotle. Joy and I, one of our big missions at our organization, 1776 Forward, is promoting our vision of what we call philosophical liberalism. And on our Substack that we recently started, where we dive into what we mean by that movement and that ideal, we talk about philosophy and that it's for everyone, everywhere, always is kind of our phrase. So starting with the foundations of which you can't really get better than Aristotle, or at least certainly as a start. I really appreciate that. It is kind of a lost art in the same way that teaching Latin and rhetoric and debate and logic, all of which used to be kind of canonical, have since kind of gone by the wayside. So that I like that idea as well. You're the first to note that on this question.
Okay.
And I think that's a good segue then, Joya's point there of like picking up on the defensive confidence, just more generally, we like to end on a note of inspiration or encouragement for anyone else out there seeking to find their voice, to stand up, speak out, and defend free speech, or just express their ideas, whatever direction they're coming from. Any tips or suggestions that you give to people, either in your professional capacity or just in general, on this issue of how to find your voice?
So I want to make sure I understand the question. Are you asking how to perhaps instill defensive confidence in yourself? Or
Essentially, well, yes, and then just more broadly, how to encourage people to stand up for free speech, and which inherently, I think, in our perspective, means being being a leader in your own life to stand up for your values.
okay, I understand. Um, I think the most powerful thing you can do, besides using rhetoric, is show by example. You know, um, enter into those debates. Show that if you do lose, it's not the end of the world. You
Mm,
know, show that if you do lose, you've learned something. Right?
hmm.
You're now better because your erroneous aspects of your idea are now gone, and you can move forward more positively, more effectively, perhaps. Right? So modeling that kind of thing, modeling civil discourse,
Mm.
um, modeling being insulted but being okay with it and talking anyway. Right? I always define civil discourse as just allowing the other person to speak back.
Mm.
That's the most simplistic definition of civil discourse that I can come up with, which means that if the person calls me a jerk or something or worse, right? As long as they allow me to speak back, that's still civil discourse, right? If you're just insulting somebody and you run away, right? That's not civil discourse. Or if you just insult somebody, that's not
Mm.
civil discourse.
Hmm.
If you make a point and then at the end of the sentence call me a hole, right?
Hmm.
As long as I'm allowed to respond to the information before the a-hole part, then we're having civil discourse. That's how I feel about it. Call me whatever name you want, as long as we have the conversation.
Well, and in so doing, right, even in being able to respond and presumably respond with a lot more grace and maturity, then I think that even exposes the fallacy of kind of the ad hominem that someone is using, right, to name
Yes,
call. So
right,
it's like
exactly.
a twofer in that respect of engaging in civil discourse.
Hmm. Well said.
Excellent. Well, thank you. That is, we're at pretty much at the end of our time. So thank you for your time and wonderful insights. As always, for all of our listeners out there, you can find us every 2 weeks on most major audio platforms under the Institute for Liberal Values Dissidents page, as well as their YouTube Dissidents page, and also linked from our website, 1776forward.com. And we will also include further background on Erec's work when we post this one. See you in 2 weeks. Thanks, Erec.
Thank you.